All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Thompson, the Deputy Research Director here at the Administrative Conference of the United States. And I want to welcome you to the third of 6 panels in ACUS's ongoing forum on underserved communities and the regulatory process. Today's panel focuses on barriers that can prevent members of underserved communities from participating in regulatory policy. We have an extraordinary collection of speakers to address that topic, starting with Professor Bertrand Ross, who will be moderating today's panel. Professor Ross is a public member here at ACUS and the Justice Thurgood Marshall Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. He teaches and writes about constitutional law and theory, election law, statutory interpretation, and of course, administrative law. And on that note, I will turn it over to Professor Ross.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's great to be here. Let me just start by describing a report for the Administrative Conference of the United States in 2018, in which Professor Michael Sanambrogio and Glenn Suzuki describe how so-called sophisticated stakeholders, which included regulated entities, industry groups, and professional associations, have dominated the notice and comment process. While national public interest organizations, regulated beneficiaries, smaller entities, and members of the general public participate much less, and sometimes not at all, in these processes. These findings accord with previous studies by political scientists and law professors, finding that members of marginalized groups, including racial minorities and the poor, are mostly absent from administrative processes. These disparities in participation undermine the democratizing objectives of the administrative processes, such as notice and comment. As Sanambrogio and Suzuki argue, the non-participation of important segments of the population in administrative processes undermine the democratic accountability and legitimacy of regulations, thereby reducing their effectiveness as governing tools. Today, I have the pleasure of moderating a panel of esteemed representatives and advocates for underserved communities and groups, who will be addressing questions regarding the barriers to participation in administrative rulemaking and adjudication. For this panel, I'd like to start by introducing Suzanne Anardi. Ms. Anardi is Chief Executive Officer of Rural Community Assistance Corporation, or RCAC, and a lifelong rural resident, leader, and champion for rural culture. Her 30-year career began in rural Colorado as founding executive director of a nonprofit building a single-purpose organization into a diverse community development entity. Subsequently, as Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC's vice president, she led rural LISC's national community housing and economic revitalization work, partnering with and through rural community-based organizations, serving 2,200 plus community counties across 45 states. Ms. Anardi is a member of the U.S. Bank Community Advisory Committee and serves as a board member for the National Rural Housing Coalition, California Coalition for Rural Housing, and Rural Community Assistance Partnership. Lisa Kyler Barrett is a director of policy at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where she leads and manages the policy work for the organization and serves as a member of the senior management team, which develops and executes the strategic direction for the organization. Ms. Kyler Barrett has over 25 years of combined experience in the legal, philanthropic, and nonprofit sectors, where she has worked tirelessly to effectively execute multi-pronged strategies to expand democracy, eliminate disparities, and achieve racial justice. Prior to LDF, Ms. Kyler Barrett served as the managing director of federal policy at PolicyLink. In that position, she oversaw the development and execution of strategies to advance racial and economic equity on a wide range of issues, including infrastructure investment, housing, education, transportation, access to healthy food, water, and economic inclusion. And during her tenure at PolicyLink, Ms. Kyler Barrett led many critical federal policy efforts, including the successful effort to include the Promised Neighborhood Cradle to Career program and other equity-focused language in the 2015 reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, thereby securing a federal program focused on providing critical social and academic support to children in communities of highly concentrated poverty. She also defended the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and advanced the implementation of the authorized healthy food finance initiative. Sue Tierney, is a senior advisor at Analyst Group Incorporated in Denver, Colorado. Ms. Tierney is an expert on economics, regulation, and environmental policy affecting the electric and natural gas industries. At Analysis Group, she has served as a consultant to a variety of clients, including state governments, environmental groups, foundations, energy companies, grid operators, universities, Indian tribes, consumer groups, and others. Previously, Sue served as the Assistant Secretary for Policy at the United States Department of Energy, and in Massachusetts, she was the Secretary of Environmental Affairs Commissioner at the Department of Public Utilities and Director of the state's Energy Facilities Siting Council. Ms. Tierney currently serves on a number of boards, including Climate Works Foundation, Resources for the Future, the Bar Foundation, World Resources Institute, and the Energy Foundation. She chairs the External Advisory Committee Council of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and is a member of several national academies committees, including the Future of Electric Power in America and Accelerating Decarbonization in the United States. And finally, we have Eric Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez is the Senior Vice President at Unidos US, the largest national Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. Mr. Rodriguez oversees the Office of Policy and Advocacy, which is charged with directing the organization's legislative affairs, public policy research, policy analysis, and field advocacy work, and is responsible for the Unidos US federal and state legislative priorities and agenda. From 2007 to 2008, Mr. Rodriguez served as Deputy Vice President of the Public Policy Department and previously directed the Policy Analysis Center, a position he held for 5 years. His background also includes work on such issues as tax policy, Social Security, welfare reform, workforce development, retirement security, as well as housing and financial market regulations. Mr. Rodriguez has authored, co-authored, and supervised the preparation of dozens of policy and research reports, journal articles, and editorials. And he has frequently testified at congressional hearings and represented Unidos US at its research conferences, policy conferences, and symposia. Mr. Rodriguez serves on the boards of the Food Research and Action Center, the Fair Election Center, and the NCLR Action Board. And prior to joining Unidos US, Mr. Rodriguez was a Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Fellow and served in U.S. Representative Nydia Velasquez's office. Okay, so that's it for introductions of the esteemed panelists, and let me just kind of start by providing opening with a question that I will direct at Eric. Let me start with you, Eric, with the who question, which I think is appropriate, speaking to a panel comprised of representatives of underserved communities and groups. So the who question is who, if anyone, tends to speak for the interests of underserved communities in agency decision-making processes. And then through what means do these individuals and groups speak for the interests of underserved communities in agency decision-making processes?
Well, thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep, hear you great.
Okay, great. Well, I want to I thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's a great pleasure. You know, one of the things that Unidos US is an umbrella organization for about 300 community-based organizations all across the country who do a range of public services, and they're in many ways our main partners in work with federal agencies and with Congress and with others. So that's an important way in which we engage federal agencies. And the question again, Bertrand?
So it's focusing on the who question, right?
Yeah.
And so as a representative of Hispanic organizations throughout the country, as an umbrella organization, in your engagement with administrative processes, who tends to speak for the interests of underserved communities? And the follow-up question that's related to it is, how do these groups and entities speak for the interests of underserved communities in agency processes?
Yeah, there's a range. And I think part of the question is, where do we need to communicate concerns and voice and provide input? For federal agencies, generally, it's going to be those intermediaries, those nonprofits who are tracking closely the policy issues, who perhaps worked on the legislation that underrides the law, and has a set of constituents that are affected by any agency actions under discussion. In Congress, there's a different set of actors that may be expressing views and perspectives on behalf of communities to lawmakers. There you can have organizations that organize in communities. You could have parent organizations. You can have a full range that direct more of their action and their voice to lawmakers and politicians. But a lot of times they're not the same ones that are directing their action toward federal agencies. That process tends to be, quite frankly, fairly elite for a variety of reasons that will probably come up, during this discussion about some of the barriers that exist for communities to engage where they should in the process of, making, federal rules and regulations and guidance.
All right. And turning to you, Ms. Kyler Barrett, you've worked on regulations recently involving HUD and the Affirmative Furthering Fair Housing rule that was ultimately issued. And thinking about your extensive involvement with administrative processes, who have you identified as entities and individuals speaking for underserved communities and agency processes, both from the outside perspective of advocacy, but also from the inside perspective within the agency itself, and how do they ultimately engage in this process of speaking for these interests, for the interests of underserved communities?
Thanks, Bertrand, and let me just say thank you also for inviting me to participate. I think this is such an important conversation, and I'm so glad to see us having this conversation, not just about how dollars get invested, but how barriers and biases that are embedded into the system preclude underserved communities from engaging in the process. I would agree with Eric that in terms of sort of administrative rulemaking, I think largely you're seeing response from organizations like ours, right? That national civil rights organizations or organizations, national organizations that are representing particular communities. I will say, at least for LDF and also for PolicyLink, when I worked at PolicyLink, there often is an effort within those organizations to also engage, grassroots organizations and people in community to ensure that, what we are putting forward is in alignment with what the community would want to say in response to whatever the proposed rule is or proposed initiative is. But as I think we'll probably get into further in this conversation, sort of the structure and the resources and capacity that are often required to be able to respond, I think has meant historically that you're having sort of national organizations engage. I'll say another way that a number of our organizations try to ensure that it's not just us speaking for the communities we represent, but also representatives from the communities themselves participating, is that when there are opportunities or the ability to engage with community, and then those organizations may take on sort of the responsibility of pulling those comments into a document that a number of folks can sign on to or draw from, in sharing their own comments and perspectives. Often that's happening also, so that many times our organizations are trying to help facilitate our communities being involved in that conversation. But I would say, I think we'll get into this later, but there are some things that we might consider that would allow folks in community to engage more directly themselves. To your question about, folks within the administration, I think this is where it's so critical when we're thinking about nominations and appointments in key positions, that we are expanding or diversifying who's being put into those positions. So they are people that are coming from these communities that have sort of real life experience in these communities that they will be able to bring to bear in those positions. And as critical decisions are being made, they're bringing that experience into that decision-making process. And so we think it's so important as folks are considering nominees to the high positions, but also, as we think about folks in the career positions and other positions, that they are drawing on folks who have experience working in these communities, experience living in these communities, that they will be able to bring to bear in their day-to-day efforts.
Yeah, important points, because I often feel those nominations to these positions are overlooked, right? With respect to administrative agencies, and often not realized by the public how critical of a role that they ultimately play in decisions that impact their lives in fundamental ways. Ms. Nardi, you represent rural communities as part of Rural Community Assistance Corporation, and my sense of rural communities is that they're quite diffuse and dispersed, and perhaps organizing them may raise some interesting challenges. And I was wondering, in terms of your experience in answering the who question across rural communities, who has served as the representatives, or who has spoke for these communities and agency processes, and how have they gone about speaking for these communities?
Thank you, and I'm really honored to be part of this panel and to learn and listen as well. I think the important thing about rural, tribal, and Indigenous communities to remember is that if you've been to one, you've been to one. They are all very diverse. Their economies are different. Everything about an individual community is different. We tend to be lumped into this place where, those folks that live off the beaten path, those kinds of things. But I think that who speaks for them? RCAC, we work in the rural Western 13 states, including Alaska and Hawaii. We have 170 employees. Over 100 of those live and work in the communities where we work. So I think I loved what Lisa talked about, how can we really embody and empower the actual residents of those communities to speak. And so in our world, much like both Eric and Lisa said, it really is the intermediaries. I would say that we're the bridge. Sometimes we are the spokesperson, but often we're the bridge between what we are seeing as we're providing technical assistance. I don't call it building capacity, I call it elevating capacity, because our communities have capacity. We just need to elevate it and help them refine it. When we're doing that, we hear and we see a lot of things. So what we try to do is elevate that to there's strong voices in this space that have connections and have the relationships. So it might be CDFIs, we're a CDFI. It might be intermediaries. We have national collaboratives. The National Rural Housing Coalition is a group of grassroots folks. And when we need to weigh in on USDA 502 mortgage cost overruns, that's where we go to try to influence policy or try to influence regulations that can address that. So I think there are a lot of places. I like the umbrella term, because I think there are a lot of collaboratives. There are CDFIs, there are nonprofit grassroots groups who are part of larger networks. And so I think there's an infrastructure that we utilize, but when it comes down to it, I have to agree with Lisa. There are a lot of barriers, and I know we're going to talk about this later, that really diffuse the message that comes from the actual community members. And oftentimes rural communities, Indigenous communities may counter each other. And so there's all of those things trying to figure out, because a rural California community is not like a rural New Mexico community, and neither is it on the tribal side. So I think that it's really important is what is that bridge for their voices to be heard, and who's doing that, and how authentic is that voice?
Yeah, and we'll kind of move to those issues of meaningful participation on the next question. But before we get there, I wanted to turn this question over to Ms. Tierney. Often, environmental groups, seem to have a pretty well-oiled machine at times in terms of their advocacy. We just saw the COP 26 conference in Glasgow, which was an important conference, which we'll see how far it moves the needle with respect to this existential issue of climate change. But how have you sort of found it with respect to the environmental groups that you consult with and that you work with in terms of who is speaking for them in administrative processes and how they are speaking for them?
Thanks for that question, Bertrand. And like everyone else, I really want to thank ACUS for including me in this panel. Suzanne, it's an honor for me as well to listen and learn too. My angle on this comes not from being a member of a nonprofit, although I am affiliated with some. It's more from having observed public policy making in regulatory arenas for 30 years. And in the environmental area, there tend to be, I would say, a couple of different intermediary groups that in one way or another show up and represent themselves as being spokespersons or advocates for underserved communities. There are the environmental groups, and one of the things, and there are big green environmental groups, and then there are quite local environmental groups. They have very different points of view, very different resources typically, and often they are looking at something from the perspective of the environment first, rather than a set of constituencies that may be worried about the accumulated effects of air pollution from living in a frontline community where there's buses and diesels and a power plant or a refinery, a lot of different things going on. And the environmental groups may come in an invaluable way, but mainly looking at one issue that may be important to that environmental group. There are also intermediaries that come in the form of consumer advocates and trying to keep the price of energy low, let's say, so that it is accessible for everybody, including quite poor people. And they tend to be quite hyper focused on dollars and what's going to go into rates. And that is a critically important function in many of these, approvals of energy facilities or the design of electric and gas rates. But there are sometimes things that could be included in rates that actually are making the energy service more affordable. And so that you see these tensions going across in terms of a single advocacy position that maybe is looking at a disaggregated group of constituencies in a more homogeneous way. So there's, it's fantastic that these groups are there. They may not always be representing in my arena, in my experience, the issues of real heartbreak and concern for frontline communities.
Right. So moving forward in terms of, before I gave the second question, I wanted to offer to the audience, if you have questions, to answer them through the Q&A function, and I will ask them later in on our panel. But let's kind of jump into the issues of participation and the separation between participation and meaningful participation. There's processes that are quite open, right? Notice the comment process is famous for its democratization of administrative procedures in ways that were quite innovative at the time and still are quite important now. But the participation that they offer is not always meaningful, particularly to underserved communities. And I was wondering if the panelists, and I'll switch the order a little bit, but if the panelists could provide some examples of the tangible and practical barriers to meaningful participation in regulatory agency decision-making, whether they be technical, legal, financial, informational, or a combination of all the above or others. And so let me just start with you, Ms. Nardi, in terms of speaking from the perspective of the rural, indigenous, and native communities that you represent, the barriers to participation in regulatory decision-making that you've seen and experienced.
Again, I think it boils down to awareness and who is being the bridge for folks. Most small communities have they have a city clerk who may be part-time. They have a maintenance guy who does everything, including digging graves. And so if you're looking at it from the local government perspective, they are meeting they're burning it at both ends just to provide services. So then you take a step back and you go to the county level, because that's where the capacity is in the local governments. And you have a county that may have a county seat, and that's where they're located, and they're going to view it from the county seat perspective versus all of the little small outlying communities. So the first thing is awareness. Like, how do folks understand that they have an opportunity? Number one. Number two, how do they learn how to engage? And I mean, we've read some of the rules. They're complicated, right? And understanding and connecting the dots on how does this impact me in Fowler, Colorado, population 1,248, right? How is this going to impact me? And then being able to articulate alternatives or whatever. So it's complicated because of scale, because of the number of folks, but it's also complicated in that the process is often foreign or slanted towards the micropolitan or the large community within their county or within where their collaborative partners are. So you have that. And then you also have, like, at the tribal level, their governance usually turns over every 2 years. So you may get like a go-getter in a tribal position, but they're only there for 2 years. So I think the local government piece, it makes it difficult, and the sparsity of folks. But I also think that it's an education and it's an understanding. And so I think that's where organizations like the ones that are represented on this panel are so important, because we build a relationship because we're the ones they call when their water system fails. We're the ones that have the circuit rider with the tribe that, they call into the Navajo Nation when their wells go out and COVID is rampant, right? So building on those relationships and building our partners to where we can communicate and they can understand what needs to happen. But it's that link. And we can't be everywhere, and there are organizations like ours, but it really is building the awareness, having access to the internet. And I know broadband's a big word right now, but it's also a really big thing to fix and to make happen. And so rural communities, tribal communities, Indigenous communities don't often get information the same way that urban communities do. I have a board member that's in Alaska, and she works for one of the health organizations. She was talking about how hard it is to explain to even health providers and information that there's not a road system. There's no road system there. So it's really, I think, for rural Indigenous tribal communities, it's about having the number of folks that can be aware of getting the information and then being able to respond, and having that knowledge and that experience base of understanding how things are going to impact and how to respond.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it in terms of what you just said, Ms. Nardi, in terms of, often you see desire to be engaged when there's a crisis, right? But when there's kind of the day-to-day life that's happening around us, in which policy is being made that will influence our lives, right? That chance and opportunity and knowledge or awareness to engage is just not there. And so you often have these underserved communities that are not sort of active and meaningful participants in the ongoing policy life. Mr. Rodriguez, in terms of your experiences that you have found with respect to some of the tangible, practical barriers to meaningful participation.
Yeah, sure. I agree with a lot of what's been said by Suzanne. I mean, sometimes the rules are really arcane. The notices are hard to understand. The time period for getting up to speed and to give meaningful and good quality responses is too narrow. It's difficult, even for groups that are paying attention who are part of the legislative process in some way, have a real hard time participating in the rulemaking part of the conversation, because it's just too complex. At times, things that are in the notices or Q&As that feel like they're good proposals, like flexibility, may actually be bad ones if you're not paying close attention to, the details. And some of the ways that we as intermediaries work with our organizations to make it easier for them to participate are not things that the agencies value. Right, like the sign-on letters that Lisa mentioned, or these form responses, steps that we take to try and make more people participate in the process are also things that don't register that highly for the agency in input and commentary, and that's unfortunate. And we worked on very serious things, from the Affordable Care Act, regulations, to the CFPB doing their payday lending rules, which can be really complicated. Again, for those that are even following it, at least I'm sure can say something about the affirmatively furthering rule. It can be really complex to be able to engage in that process unless you know what you're doing. So and I haven't even touched on language barriers to the process for many frontline communities, or cultural competency. That's a big part of the process, and making sure that and Lisa mentioned it just right, which is, look, when you have a diverse workforce, the chances of you getting more cultural competency in the process are a lot higher. And oftentimes we're working with agencies that don't have very diverse workforces in place. And that means the task for us is much harder.
Yeah, and a very important points made there. You look at the Code of Federal Registrar, you see the thickness of that code, the challenges that you just faced trying to make it through different agency regulations, whether it be at the notice process or after that. And as a person who tries to be knowledgeable on these things, if they're challenging to me, I can only imagine for those who are not as steeped into it in their day-to-day lives. And I think that and another point, more important point that you make is, what should the value be of intensity and expression of preferences, right? Even if they do come in a form letter, the fact that it's a form letter that is being signed on by many members of community, how much value should those letters have? You often see agency decision makers make the point that it's not a referendum, these agency processes, but should the intensity of preferences matter, and how should they matter, are important things to think about. Let me turn it over to you, Ms. Tierney, in terms of thinking about the examples of tangible and practical barriers to meaningful participation.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said so far, so I'll try to add a couple of other things as well. How many of your neighbors have ever heard of the Federal Register? I mean, when you think about it, we spend our time on these things, and even we have to go and find out what's going on. So a clear barrier is that when we're talking about underserved and disadvantaged communities, they are disadvantaged in resources, in information, in how many of them understand what is a adjudicatory process versus a rulemaking process? Well, who's even heard of those words except us, who, this is our professional lives. Bandwidth issues, not just broadband, but bandwidth issues of being able to attend a public hearing and travel those distances from a rural community to a decision-making center. And some of us have broadband and can do it virtually now, but most people can't. So there's technical skills that are challenging and take so much time to develop. Access to legal resources. I'll give just two examples. One of them is, let's say it's an energy facility that is a pipeline that's going to be going through a rural neighborhood or rural community or an urban neighborhood. And you have an opportunity to show up in an evening public hearing. You wait for hours to make a 3-minute comment. And what can you say in 3 minutes except you don't like this thing? And so it comes off as if you're just in opposition to everything. And so there's a context for public hearing comments from the communities, which is completely outweighed in decision-making records by those who are bringing expert witness, legal briefs, and a variety of other things, and are focused on what are the standards that an agency will be bringing to bear in making its decisions. And Eric's comment about these, oh no, I guess it was yours, Bertrand, about these not being referendum. It's not just they're not referendum, but they're often, there's a disconnect between what people are passionate about and how they think something's going to connect to them and what the agency sees as its standard of review under the law. So those ones are tough. I'm thinking of another example, let's say of the air pollution rules associated with power plants, that some of which may be located next to you, and some of them are hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And each of them is emitting some kind of pollution into the air. Some of the advocates understandably want to keep the cost of this regulation down. They might like a trading program so that one power plant can buy the ability to pollute more from somebody who can pollute less. Well, the local community is very unlikely to understand the design of those regulations and what that might mean for them. And so there's just tremendous technical, legal awareness, as Suzanne said, barriers that make it so that there is a good record for decision, but not robust with regard to many of these issues.
Yeah. And you think about the public hearing context in terms of the intimidation factor, right?
So much.
The sense that I don't belong at these hearings, my input does not matter, right? And
well, it's scary to stand up in front of
it is.
people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, right? And so the way that these processes are constructed can have an excluding effect. Turning to you, Ms. Kyler Barrett, in terms of thinking about the tangible and practical barriers to meaningful participation. And I'm thinking about your earlier comment in terms of nominees and such in administrative processes and those who are going to be the agency decision makers. I also think about the fact that when you think about people of color in these administrative processes, there's not a lot of folks that look like them that are part of these processes. So, just reflecting on your experience with respect to tangible and practical barriers to meaningful participation.
Sure. I mean, I would underscore everything that everyone has already said. I think I'll start where Sue and you left off, Bertrand, and that's with public hearings. I think the other consideration in terms of capacity of folks to engage is think about if you are working 2 or more jobs, do you really have the capacity to or the time to attend an evening hearing? As even if you have been able to be aware of the hearing, understand the notice or the issue that's being presented, do you have the time and capacity to actually engage in the hearing, or for that matter, in writing and submitting, comments for a proposed rulemaking? And so there's that aspect of people who are many times in these communities, and we're talking about underserved communities, many times we're talking about individuals who are also living in very impoverished communities. And so do they have the time, the space, the resources to really engage in this process when they are doing everything they can to survive day to day, to work the 2 jobs, to sit down with their child at night when they come home from their second job before their child goes to bed? I mean, the day-to-day life, and then being able to really take the time to engage in this. And so I do think this idea of we need to make it so much more accessible and easier for folks to engage. Eric mentioned, sometimes the language itself of the notice is just intimidating for us, right? Like when you really are engaging in these spaces, I know there are days where I'm like, okay, let me get my head ready to sit down and sort of really read through this notice and understand what it is that's being proposed. And so for someone who's not engaged in that on a day-to-day basis, that's got to be incredibly difficult. And just as Suzanne said, the initial awareness and the time factor. There was, I can give an example. There was a proposed rule a few months ago that had a 30-day comment period. And for many organizations, this was an issue that I know that they wanted to weigh in on, but maybe we found out about the rule 2 weeks into the comment period, and then you have 2 weeks to pull together, understanding the comment, pull together your full comments and submit them, in addition to everything else that's going on. So not just capacity concerns for individuals and communities, but also for the organizations themselves. And I will say, particularly for civil rights organizations, and we certainly saw this over the last 4 years, issues when you're dealing with multiple issues that are impacting your community, trying to stay on top of all of those issues and address or respond to each of those proposed rules or engage in hearings or what have you. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into that. And so capacity issues abound across the board. And then just the idea of, I think Suzanne mentioned this, but, do communities have access to broadband? Do they have access to a computer? Many times those are the ways that you're responding on these issues. And if you don't have the basic equipment to be able to engage, then it makes it even much more difficult. So I think, looking at some ways, one, to have greater transparency about, what's happening in these processes, ways to share the material or the information in a, more user-friendly way, so that the writing isn't so technical and people can actually understand what's happening and engage easily. And then I think also important is for folks to feel like their input isn't going into some void or black hole, right? For them to understand what the process will be for the consideration of their input and sort of what the outcome will be. So what does that process look like? Once I submit a comment, who's considering it? How does it get factored in? Then what happens? How do I find out about the status of whatever is being proposed? All of those things, I think, factor into folks feeling like it's worth the effort to actually engage and that their voice really matters.
So I want to build off of those comments, Lisa, and introduce a question that's just been asked by the audience, because I think that within your response were some proposals for change, right, and how to make this process potentially more accessible. But Justin Lamb, excuse me, posed the question in the Q&A that I'll lead off with Eric, because you had some comments in your remarks that are responsive as well, but that maybe you could build off of. To what extent can organizations and local state governments reach people in more accessible ways within the current statutory framework or programs? And then what I think is even more critical part of the question, what changes might need to be made to either the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, or future statutes to make it easier for folks to participate? So just kind of generally in terms of how do we think about making it easier to participate, and what can we change in terms of the statutes and practices surrounding administrative processes that would make it easier to participate, that's building from what Lisa has already said?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Now, I only pretend to be a lawyer in my spare time, but I do have some thoughts, of course, on this. So one certainly is that we can make the process of engagement more active rather than passive. That's certainly one. There are some existing executive orders that can be enforced and implemented better, like the limited English proficiency executive order through agencies. There's, of course, the racial equity executive order that can help to add more data to the process. For instance, how many, is anybody counting the comments that come from underrepresented communities and reporting that out? Are we looking at numbers as it reflects some of the engagement that we're getting so far and making goals around that? There are certainly a lot of ways that we when we need authentic engagement in our communities, we do focus groups, we find ways to bring people to the table, to bring that perspective. It's a part of our processes. If we can do it, you can do it. And that is a big way of enhancing engagement, but it starts with the premise that this is a problem that needs to be fixed. And there are better ways of doing this to incentivize engagement. I mentioned earlier that we have a lot of nonprofit community-based organizations that provide a range of services. They are in many ways our partners on this. They can be partners with agencies as well in finding and engaging families who would be affected directly by rules and regulations that are being made. But we don't really see that happening in an assertive kind of way. So those are all important ways that we can get a true engagement. There's other kinds of ways that people use, for instance, patch through calls. If somebody's willing to be reached out to and connected to a federal agency because of an issue that matters to them, they are taking an extra step. If they're active enough to do that and register a concern, that should mean something. So there are some other tactics that I think can be put in place. We can also think about government interagency task forces that specifically kind of focus on this and deeper engagement from frontline communities. So I think there's a number of things that can be put on the table that I think add a bit, some of which may require additions and changes and tweaks to the law. And personally, I really hope that this emphasis currently on racial equity will in fact materialize and result in some actual legal and statutory changes to truly incentivize inclusion across our federal agencies, in addition to properly implementing some of the rules that we already have in place.
Yeah, I mean, I see a theme there in terms of having the government go to the people more, and go to these communities more, rather than demanding that the communities come to them. And when the communities do come to them, they should certainly make it as easy as possible for the government to be reached. Turning to you, Ms. Tierney, in terms of responding to that question of to what extent can organizations and local state governments reach people in more accessible ways, and what changes might need to be made to either the Administrative Procedures Act or future statutes to make it easier for folks to participate?
I want to affiliate with Eric's comments about finding ways to connect with people, both people in the agencies and people in communities. I'm familiar with one circumstance where the federal agency has preemption of authority over facilities, some energy facilities. And so the people who might be affected by those live 2,000 miles away, or in the case of Alaska, I guess Alaska's different because it's not an interstate commerce. So never mind, I'll just put that over there. But there are people who live very far away, and not only are they challenged in all the ways that they describe, but even their state is challenged for being able to make its voice known. And the one example I'm thinking of, which has been very helpful, is where the state decides that it is going to play a role and go to the different communities that are affected by the proposed facilities, have open meetings, collect information, and then move it, not in an advocacy way, but in a communications channel that has the stature of representing a state actor, but it's really aggregating different voices where the different voices can't do it themselves. Now, many of the intermediaries on this screen right now, you probably do that, which is great. And so having channels that look as though you are a fair agent in bringing a neutral overlay to the voices from the community could be very helpful. Yeah. On the Administrative Procedures Act, I'm not sure what to say. I'm going to state a problem without a solution. But many of the things that we're talking about end up, whether it's in housing or civil rights or the environment, some of the dockets that are either new rules or actual decisions on an applicant or whatever it is, they end up being quite siloed topic. And there are 16 other dockets that really are relevant too. And the people in the communities experience these quite holistically. And they have, why would they know that there's a particular docket looking at this particular issue? And so the siloed decision-making for communities that experience cumulative impacts across a lot of different themes and systems and so forth. I think that's I know intellectually why we do that. And I know that from a practical point of view, the administrative record of one thing is quite tidy in another, but maybe finding ways to cross-reference things that are also relevant that communities care about could be something that we work on to make these more holistic for people who are affected.
Yeah, great points. I think that there's the siloing, impacts the way that underserved communities interact with the administrative state, but also the way the administrative state operates, right? In the sense that sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, even though they should be working together in a coordinated way on these particular issues. Ms. Nardi, in terms of answering the question from Justin Lamb in terms of to what extent can organizations and local state governments reach people in more accessible ways, and what changes might be made to either the Administrative Procedures Act or future statutes to make it easier for folks to participate?
So first of all, I'm not a hands-off person when I'm trying to communicate, and everything that comes down the pike is very hands-off, right? You don't have a warm body coming to your community to talk about impacts or to get your input. And I think what Lisa talked about, I don't even like to get up and talk about it. I don't, it's intimidating for me because there's all these nuances that maybe I don't quite understand, but I know what the impact's going to be, right? And so I think it's really hard to, I always tease my kids that don't just throw stuff up on the wall and see what sticks, right? Like have a plan and understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so I think it's really hard for folks that are in the Beltway or are in that realm of making these rules to understand the unintended consequences if you don't go to the community. If you don't hear those stories directly, like Eric said, we try to equip our folks all the time, but we know that what's easy for them doesn't matter or have the impact that we want it to have at the root, at the powers that be, because it really is a power paradigm we're talking about, right? So I think it has to be an investment, and like Sue said, some states are really good at it. I like to think RCAC works really hard at it, but let me tell you what our barriers are. We have 13 states. That's 13 different state governments. That's however many counties. I should know that. Sorry. It's a lot. It's also, tribes and all of these different things. We are spread thin. The other thing I would say about intermediaries is it's really hard to raise money for advocacy to bridge this. So we do it in many creative ways, which means that we either grow our own or we collaborate, like the Partners for Rural Transformation. There's 6 of us. We collaborate on policy issues. But you've got Appalachia, you've got the Deep South, you've got the Mid South, you've got the West, and we're all we've all got day jobs, right? And we're trying to collaborate to have impact in these conversations. So I really think it has to be a two-way conversation. It ends up being one way, and then we cobble back a response as best we can based on somebody said resources, I believe Lisa, the resources, and those resources might be who we have on our staff that understands that issue well enough to dive into that dense document and tell me what I should be saying and what, how it impacts the different areas that we serve, which might be 13 different ways. So I think it really has to be a two-way street. And I know that there's lots of barriers on the other side. So I just want to cop to that I'm not totally Pollyanna, that why don't you come to all of my rural communities and talk about it? But I do think there's value in that, right? And if you can't come to the community and talk, have folks, like I find that at USDA, I've been around so long, I have really good relationships. And when they call me and say, we're thinking about doing this, and I say, oh my gosh, no, you can't do that because of XYZ, that's a really valuable exchange on both sides. And so I think cultivating those voices, whether it's an advisory committee, whether it's, putting fellows out, whatever it is, cultivating those voices, because if you reach out to those voices, you'll learn a lot that will add value to what you're doing, and help you get way down the road to where there's a comment period, and hopefully there's an onslaught of comments that tell you what you've got wrong. Whereas if they're part of that process of developing the procedures and all of the regulations, it's a lot easier. But it also goes back to, I think Lisa and Eric have both said it. You have to have diversity. You have to have folks in the agencies that understand, so that it's intuitive. Because if you have to stop and think about it, or you have to make have those conversations, it often doesn't happen. But if you have folks that it's intuitive, it's in their gut. Rural is my culture. That's how I talk about it. I'm going to instantly be able to say, "Ooh, wait, that's not going to work because of X, Y, Z." So
yeah. So that kind of leads to this final question. I won't be able to do the round robin because we only have 5 minutes. So I'll ask for volunteers in response to the question. And it's from an anonymous attendee. And we talked a lot about intermediaries as critical institutions for participation of underserved communities. But we all know also that underserved communities are not monolithic. They're very heterogeneous. The rural communities that you represent, Ms. Nardi, are quite diverse. The Black communities and the racial minority people of color communities that you represent, Ms. Kyler Barrett and Mr. Rodriguez, are very diverse, and environmental groups have very diverse goals with respect to who you're representing, Ms. Tierney. So how and how do we promote authenticity in the voices that are to be heard from these diverse communities? This is a very challenging question, I know, and we only have a little bit of time to answer it, but if anyone wants to volunteer a response to the challenges of the diverse communities and the small number of intermediaries that are available to represent them.
So I'll jump in and just say, I think this is where it's so critical to ensure that as many voices as possible can participate in the process, so that you are getting the diversity of voices. And so, we've all shared thoughts about ways to do that. I think some really practical things in terms of enabling folks in community to really participate have been shared, but also, just looking at how you make the materials. I think creating materials for public education about this administrative rule process and how folks can engage, and putting those out so that folks are aware that they even have this opportunity to engage. And then I do want to go back to something Sue said about the siloed decision-making that happens. And, I know that there have been efforts over the years to do more sort of cross-agency, cross-departmental work, but really thinking through that and figuring that piece out so that the complexity and the burden is really taken on by the administrative agencies, and making it easier for folks to engage. I think will also encourage a diverse chorus of voices to be able to be involved. So if I don't have to respond to 7 different proposals and instead can respond to 3 or 2, then that allows likely for greater participation and a greater diversity of voices to be engaged in that process.
Yeah. When we think about democratic processes, whether they be through the administrative state or through legislative channels or political channels, we think of sort of winners and losers, but it's much more than that. It's also the opportunity to have your voice being a part of the conversation and being a part of the decision that's made, because that voice and that opportunity to be heard can influence decisions in small and large ways. And so I appreciate all of you speaking to the challenges with respect to the barriers to participation. There's much more that can be said and needs to be said as part of this conversation going forward. There's much reform that needs to be had. And I hope that as these reform discussions are ongoing, that they'll be speaking and reaching out to all of you who have contributed so much important information for us to understand and to really reflect on with respect to the operation of the administrative state and the interaction of underserved communities with the administrative state. So I hate Zoom appreciation because you can't get the audience clap or anything like that, but I will throw up my little hand clap if I can figure out how to do it. Nope, I can't. Okay, but thank you all, and thanks all to the audience that's here, and I guess I will turn it over to Mark.
That actually concludes our forum this afternoon. We have another forum or another panel in the same forum plan coming up next week. That forum is titled that panel rather is titled Learning from Past and Present Efforts to Engage with Underserved Communities. You can register for it on the ACUS website. It'll run from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern time on November 16th. So we're looking forward to seeing you all there. And thank you so much on behalf of ACUS to all of our panelists who all were fabulous. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.